Emily and her husband, Mark, had been searching for a peaceful place to settle down after the hectic pace of city life had worn them out. When they found Hollow Grove, a small, secluded town surrounded by dense forests, it seemed perfect. The town was quiet, the people friendly, and the cost of living affordable. Best of all, they discovered an old, charming house at the edge of the woods that seemed almost too good to be true. And, as they would soon find out, it was. The house had been abandoned for years, but Emily and Mark were eager to make it their own. Despite the peeling paint and overgrown yard, it had a certain rustic charm that they couldn't resist. The realtor had mentioned something vague about the previous owners leaving in a hurry, but they didn't pay much attention. They were too busy imagining their future in this picturesque home. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. From the first night they moved in, Emily noticed things out of place. Doors that were left open when she was sure she had closed them. Objects moved from their original spots, and an overwhelming sense that they were not alone. Mark laughed it off, saying the house was old and probably settling, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As days turned into weeks, Emily began experiencing vivid nightmares. In her dreams, she saw shadowy figures moving through the house, whispering in languages she couldn't understand. She would wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, only to find herself alone in bed, with Mark fast asleep beside her. But the worst part was that every morning she would find dirt and leaves scattered across the floor, as if someone, or something, had been walking through the house at night. Desperate for answers, Emily started digging into the history of Hollow Grove. She learned that the town had a dark past, dating back to the 1800s, when it was rumored to be the site of occult practices. The woods surrounding the town were considered cursed by the local Native American tribes, who believed that dark spirits roamed the forest, preying on anyone who ventured too far into their territory. The more Emily uncovered, the more unsettled she became. She discovered that their house had once belonged to a man named Thomas Greaves, a local historian who had become obsessed with the occult. He had spent years researching the dark history of Hollow Grove, eventually going mad and disappearing under mysterious circumstances. No one knew what had happened to him, but rumors suggested that he had been practicing forbidden rituals in the woods, trying to summon something ancient and evil. One evening, as Emily sat in the living room, poring over old newspaper clippings about Thomas Greaves, the air in the room grew heavy, and the temperature dropped. She glanced up from her research to see the faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway. Her heart leaped into her throat as she blinked and the figure vanished. Trembling, she decided it was time to confront Mark about the strange happenings in the house. Mark had always been the skeptic, but even he couldn't ignore what had been going on. He admitted that he had heard footsteps in the hallway at night, and had seen glimpses of shadows out of the corner of his eye. But what disturbed him the most was the strange carvings he had found in the basement. Symbols that looked like they had been etched into the walls by hand. The carvings matched the descriptions Emily had found in her research. They were symbols used in ancient rituals meant to summon dark entities. It was clear that Thomas Greaves had been performing these rituals in their house, and the presence they were feeling was a result of his actions. Determined to put an end to the strange occurrences, Mark suggested they destroy the carvings in the basement, but Emily wasn't so sure. She feared that by destroying them, they might accidentally release whatever Greaves had summoned, unleashing something far worse than the strange occurrences they had been experiencing. That night, the nightmares grew more intense. Emily dreamed of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with hollow black eyes. She woke with a start, gasping for breath, only to find that the room was ice cold. Mark was nowhere to be found. Panicked, she jumped out of bed and ran through the house, calling his name. She found him in the basement, standing in front of the carvings. His eyes glazed over and his hands outstretched toward the wall. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood, and the symbols on the wall seemed to be glowing with a faint, eerie light. When she shook Mark, he snapped out of his trance, but he had no memory of how he had ended up in the basement. He was as confused and terrified as Emily. It was clear that whatever was haunting their house was growing stronger and more dangerous. Emily reached out to a paranormal investigator who had studied the history of Hollow Grove. When the investigator arrived, he confirmed their worst fears. The symbols in the basement were part of an ancient curse, designed to bind a dark entity to the house. Thomas Greaves had been trying to control the entity, but something had gone wrong. Instead of containing it, he had unleashed it, and it had been feeding off the energy of the house ever since. The only way to banish the entity, the investigator said, was to perform a cleansing ritual in the woods where the original summoning had taken place. But there was a catch. The ritual would require confronting the entity directly. The following evening, armed with the necessary supplies and the instructions from the investigator, Emily and Mark ventured into the dark woods behind their house. The trees loomed tall and ominous, casting long shadows in the fading light. The further they walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt as if the very air around them was watching, waiting for something. They reached a clearing in the woods where the investigator set up a circle of protection with salt and began chanting the words of the ritual. The air around them grew colder, and the wind began to howl, whipping through the trees with an unnatural force. Shadows flickered at the edges of the clearing, darting in and out of the trees as if they were alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and a dark figure appeared at the edge of the circle. It was the entity, a towering, shadowy being with hollow eyes and a twisted humanoid form. It let out a bone-chilling scream that seemed to reverberate through the entire forest, shaking the trees and sending a wave of terror through Emily and Mark. The investigator shouted for them to hold their ground, but the entity lunged forward, slamming into the invisible barrier of the protective circle. The force of the impact knocked Emily to the ground, and for a moment, she was sure the barrier would break. But the investigator's chants grew louder and the entity was pushed back, writhing in pain as the ritual took hold. As the ritual reached its climax, the entity let out a final, ear-piercing scream before dissolving into a cloud of black smoke. The air grew still, and an eerie silence fell over the clearing. It was over. Emily and Mark returned to their house, exhausted but relieved. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued their home for weeks was gone, and the strange occurrences stopped. For the first time since they had moved in, the house felt like their own. But even as they settled back into their lives, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, lurking just beyond the edge of the woods, waiting for its chance to return. John and Sarah had just bought their first home together, an old house on the outskirts of a quiet town. From the outside, the house looked charming, with its Victorian architecture and sprawling yard. However, there was one part of the house that didn't sit right with Sarah: the basement. The previous owner had kept the basement locked, warning that it was unsafe due to mold. But John, ever the handyman, was excited to renovate it into a hobby room. From the moment they moved in, strange things started happening. Lights flickered, doors creaked, and at night, Sarah swore she could hear faint whispering coming from the floor below. John brushed it off as the sounds of an old house settling. But deep down, Sarah knew something wasn't right. One night as they lay in bed, Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps creaking on the floorboards above them. She nudged John awake, but when he went to investigate, he found nothing out of place. Despite his reassurances, Sarah felt a growing sense of dread that something was lurking in their new home. A few weeks later, while cleaning out the attic, John stumbled upon an old box filled with dusty photos, letters, and a journal. The journal belonged to the house's previous owner, a man named Mr. Grayson, who had lived there alone for many years. As John flipped through the pages, he noticed that Grayson had written about hearing voices in the house, voices that seemed to come from the basement. The more John read, the more unnerved he became. Grayson's entries became more erratic, talking about shadows moving on their own, strange symbols appearing on the walls, and a feeling of being watched. The last entry in the journal was scrawled hastily. "I've locked it away, but I can still hear it. God help anyone who opens that door." That night, John couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the basement door and what could possibly be hidden behind it. The temptation to unlock it grew stronger by the day. Despite Sarah's protests, she had started having nightmares, dreams of something dark and malicious lurking in the basement, waiting to be set free. One evening, while Sarah was out visiting friends, John finally gave in to his curiosity. He grabbed the old key he had found in the attic and made his way to the basement door. His heart pounded as he inserted the key into the lock and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty staircase leading down into the blackness below. Armed with a flashlight, John descended into the basement. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the cold seemed to seep into his bones. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the beam of his flashlight fell on something strange, a circle of symbols drawn in what looked like red chalk, surrounding an old wooden chest. The symbols were unfamiliar, but John could feel the malevolence emanating from them. Against his better judgment, he approached the chest, his curiosity overpowering his fear. The lid was slightly ajar, as if beckoning him to look inside. With trembling hands, he lifted it open, only to be hit with a rush of cold air and the overwhelming scent of decay. Inside the chest were dozens of tattered dolls, each one missing its eyes. John's stomach churned as he reached out to touch one, but the moment his fingers brushed against it, a voice whispered in his ear, "You shouldn't have opened it." From that night on, everything changed. The once subtle whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the house with an oppressive presence. Objects moved on their own. Shadows darted across the walls, and Sarah began waking up with scratches on her arms and legs. Desperate for answers, they reached out to a local historian, who informed them that the house had a dark past. It was built on land once used for occult rituals, and many of the previous owners had gone mad or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The dolls in the basement, the historian said, were part of a curse, each one representing a soul trapped within the house. Terrified, John and Sarah tried to sell the house, but no one was interested in buying a property with such a sinister reputation. They were trapped, forced to live with the growing horror that now consumed their home. As the weeks passed, the presence in the house grew stronger, and it wasn't long before it turned violent. John began experiencing blackouts, waking up in different parts of the house with no memory of how he got there. Sarah found him one night standing in the basement, muttering in a language she didn't recognize. His eyes were glazed over, and when she shook him, he simply laughed, a deep, guttural sound that wasn't his own. The house was no longer just haunted, it was alive, feeding off their fear and desperation. They brought in a priest to bless the house, but as soon as he stepped foot inside, he was overcome with a violent fit, screaming about demons and curses before collapsing on the floor. John's condition worsened. He became violent, attacking Sarah in his sleep and blaming her for what was happening. The man she had married was gone, replaced by something dark and twisted. Realizing they couldn't escape the house, Sarah made a desperate decision. She returned to the historian, who told her that the only way to break the curse was to destroy the dolls in the basement. But there was a catch. The curse would fight back. Armed with gasoline and a box of matches, Sarah went to the basement, her heart pounding in her chest. As she began dousing the dolls with fuel, the whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Shadows writhed in the corners of the room, and the temperature dropped so low that her breath came out in visible puffs. Just as she struck the match, John appeared at the top of the stairs, his eyes glowing with a sinister light. He lunged at her, screaming for her to stop, but Sarah lit the match and threw it into the chest. The fire erupted instantly, engulfing the dolls and the symbols on the floor. John collapsed, writhing in agony as the flames consumed the cursed objects. The house itself seemed to groan in pain as the fire spread, but Sarah didn't stop. She watched as the dark presence was finally destroyed, taking her husband with it. In the end, all that remained of Ridgeview House was a smoldering ruin. Sarah, broken and alone, left the town, vowing never to return. But even as she drove away, she could still hear the faint whispers of the house, lingering in her mind like a dark shadow that would never truly leave her. The first time, after months of searching, they had finally found what seemed like the perfect place to start a new chapter in their lives. A large, two-story home at the end of a quiet street. It had been on the market for a while, which worked in their favor. The previous owners had left town suddenly, which made the property affordable. The couple chalked it up to good luck, eager to turn the house into a home. As they stepped inside, Sarah couldn't help but smile. The house was old, with hardwood floors and vintage fixtures that gave it a charming, nostalgic feel. It was exactly what she had dreamed of. David, though more practical, also appreciated the potential the house held. "This is it," he said, squeezing Sarah's hand. "Our new beginning." For the first few weeks, things were perfect. They painted the walls, moved in their furniture, and began to settle into their new lives. But it wasn't long before Sarah started hearing the whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs coming from behind the walls. At first, she thought it was just the sound of the old house settling, but the whispers grew louder, more persistent, and seemed to follow her from room to room. She mentioned it to David, but he brushed it off, saying she was probably just hearing the wind or the creaks of an old house. Still, Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something, or someone, was trying to communicate with her. As the days passed, the whispers became harder to ignore. No matter where Sarah was in the house, she could hear them, soft voices, like a distant conversation happening just beyond her reach. Sometimes they were so quiet that she could almost convince herself they weren't real. But at night, when the house was silent and David was fast asleep, the whispers would intensify. One night, unable to sleep, Sarah got out of bed and wandered through the house. She stood in the living room, listening to the soft murmur of voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She pressed her ear against the wall, straining to make out what they were saying, but the words were muffled and indistinct. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute that it was almost deafening. Sarah stepped back, heart racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. She turned to go back upstairs, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. She froze, her eyes darting to the hallway. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Sarah blinked, and the figure was gone. Shaken, she hurried back to bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't tell David what she had seen. She didn't want him to think she was losing her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong with the house. Determined to find answers, Sarah began researching the history of the house. She visited the local library, digging through old records and newspaper articles. What she found sent a chill down her spine. The house had once belonged to a man named Henry Forrester, a reclusive artist who had lived there in the early 1900s. According to the articles, Forrester had been known for his disturbing paintings, dark, grotesque images that were said to have been inspired by the spirits that haunted him. He had become obsessed with the idea that his house was a gateway to another world, and that the voices he heard in the walls were those of the dead, trying to communicate with him. Forrester's obsession had eventually driven him mad. One night he disappeared without a trace, leaving behind his unfinished paintings and a cryptic journal filled with strange symbols and ramblings about the whispers and the others. Sarah's hands shook as she read the final article, which mentioned that Forrester's wife had also disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The house had been vacant for years after that, with several families moving in and out, none of them staying for long. She returned home, her mind racing. Was it possible that the whispers she had been hearing were the same ones Forrester had written about in his journal? Was the house truly haunted? That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The whispers seemed louder than ever, and she felt a growing sense of unease. She got out of bed and wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. As she passed the hallway where she had seen the figure, she stopped. There was something off about the wall at the end of the hall, a faint outline, as if a door had once been there but had been covered up. Curiosity getting the better of her, Sarah pressed her hand against the wall. It was hollow. She ran her fingers along the edges, feeling for any gaps, and found a small, almost invisible latch. With trembling hands, she pulled it, and the wall swung open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. Her heart pounding, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs. The air grew colder as she went deeper, and the whispers seemed to grow louder, echoing around her in the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, she found a small, hidden room. The room was filled with old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room was an easel with a half-finished painting on it, a dark, twisted landscape that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. On the walls were more paintings, all of them grotesque and disturbing. And in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a large, ornate mirror. As Sarah approached the mirror, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She stared at her reflection, but something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving with her. It stood still, staring back at her with hollow eyes. Suddenly, the reflection smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that sent a wave of terror through her. She stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The room was plunged into darkness, and the whispers became deafening, surrounding her from all sides. Slammed the hidden door shut and ran to the bedroom, her mind racing. She had seen something in that room, something unnatural, something evil. She couldn't explain it, but she knew the house was haunted by more than just whispers. There was something lurking in the walls, watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. David was skeptical when she told him about the hidden room, but he agreed to take a look the next morning. When they opened the hidden door again, the room was exactly as Sarah had left it, except for the mirror. It was cracked, the glass splintered into jagged shards, as if something had tried to break free from inside. Over the next few days, Sarah's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would disappear for hours at a time, only to return with no memory of where she had been. At night, she would wake up screaming, convinced that something was watching her from the shadows. David, growing more and more concerned, tried to help her, but there was nothing he could do. The whispers were constant now, filling Sarah's mind with dark, twisted thoughts. She felt as if she were losing control, as if something was trying to take over her body. Desperate to save Sarah, David reached out to a local medium, hoping that she could help rid the house of whatever dark presence was haunting it. The medium arrived one evening, her face grave as she stepped inside the house. She walked through the rooms, her expression growing more and more troubled as she listened to the whispers. Finally, she stopped in front of the hidden door. "This house is cursed," she said. "The spirit of Henry Forrester still lingers here, trapped between worlds. His obsession with the other side has opened a gateway, and now, something far darker has taken hold." The medium instructed David to destroy the mirror in the hidden room. "It is the source of his power," she explained. "Only by breaking the mirror can you close the gateway and free Sarah from his influence." That night, armed with a hammer, David descended the stairs into the hidden room. The whispers were louder than ever, and as he approached the mirror, he could see Henry Forrester's reflection staring back at him. Forrester's eyes were hollow, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. With a shout, David swung the hammer, shattering the mirror into 1,000 pieces. The room erupted in a burst of cold air, and the whispers stopped. When he returned upstairs, Sarah was waiting for him, her eyes clear for the first time in weeks. The curse had been broken, and the house was finally free of its dark influence. The old colonial house stood at the edge of a small town, isolated from the rest of the community by dense woods. From the moment Julia and her family stepped through the front door, it felt like a fresh start. After years of living in cramped apartments, this was the house they had always dreamed of. Spacious, with a large backyard and tall, wide windows that let in the afternoon light. Julia's husband, Mark, was particularly excited about the home office upstairs. Their 10-year-old daughter, Lily, immediately fell in love with the attic, which she quickly declared would be her secret space. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. The family enjoyed the new space, and Julia spent her time decorating, making the house feel warm and welcoming. Yet there was something about the house that unsettled her. She brushed it off at first, blaming it on the stress of the move and her general sense of unease in a new place. But at night, when the house was quiet, she would wake up to strange noises. Soft creaks, as though someone were walking just outside their bedroom door. Mark, being the practical one, chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe a raccoon in the attic. But deep down, Julia wasn't convinced. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched. Whenever she walked through the house, particularly in the basement, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, as Julia was unpacking boxes in the living room, Lily ran downstairs with a worried expression on her face. "Mom, there's something in the attic," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid she might be followed. "I heard noises up there, like someone walking around." Julia sighed, assuring Lily it was probably just the house settling, but her daughter's pale face told her it was more than that. As the weeks passed, the strange occurrences grew more frequent. Objects began disappearing, only to reappear in odd places. Doors would creak open on their own, and the soft sound of footsteps echoed through the house, always just out of sight. One night, Julia woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. She nudged Mark, who groggily muttered something about checking it out in the morning. Frustrated but unwilling to let it go, Julia got out of bed and quietly stepped into the hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the staircase. As she descended, she noticed something strange. The door to the basement was open, just slightly ajar. She distinctly remembered closing it earlier that evening. She stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. There was a faint sound coming from below, like whispering. It was barely audible, but it was there. For a moment, she considered going back to bed, pretending she hadn't heard anything. But something inside her urged her to investigate. With trembling hands, Julia grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made her way down the stairs to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the feeling of being watched intensified. She swept the flashlight beam across the room, but everything seemed normal. The same boxes of old belongings, the washer and dryer, the bare concrete walls. Then she saw it. In the far corner of the basement, behind a pile of boxes, the wall looked different. There was a faint outline of a door, one that hadn't been there before. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached it. The door was old, its wood rotting and covered in dust. It was clear that it hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. Hesitant, Julia reached out and touched the handle. As soon as her fingers made contact with the cold metal, a chill ran down her spine. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if they were coming from the other side of the door. Without thinking, she pulled it open. Beyond the door was a small, cramped room that smelled of damp earth and mildew. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were dozens of small, old wooden boxes, each with a name carved into the lid. The room had an oppressive feel to it, and Julia could barely stand to be inside for more than a few seconds. But what disturbed her the most were the shadows. Even with the flashlight in hand, the corners of the room were unnaturally dark, as though the light couldn't quite reach them. And in those shadows, Julia saw movement. At first, she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks on her, but then she realized there were figures moving in the darkness, shifting and writhing as if they were trapped just beyond the veil of light. Panicked, she slammed the door shut and ran back upstairs, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't sleep that night, and when Mark asked her what was wrong the next morning, she simply told him she had had a bad dream. But Julia knew it wasn't a dream. The whispers, the shadows, they were real. The next few days were filled with tension. The strange occurrences continued, but now they were more frequent and more sinister. Julia found herself avoiding the basement entirely, unwilling to confront whatever was lurking in that hidden room. But it wasn't long before the attic began to show signs of something unnatural as well. Lily, who had been spending most of her time in the attic playing with her toys, started complaining about hearing whispers, just like Julia had. One evening, while Julia was preparing dinner, Lily came downstairs, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Mom," she said in a quiet, shaky voice, "I saw something in the attic." Julia's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "There's a thing. It was standing in the corner. It was really tall, and it didn't have a face. I tried to leave, but it wouldn't let me. It just kept watching me." Julia felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. "Did it hurt you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily shook her head. "No, but I think it wants something." That night, Julia couldn't sleep. Every creak, every whisper felt like a warning, as though the house itself was trying to tell her something. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past few weeks swirling in her mind. The whispers in the basement, the shadowy figures, the thing in the attic. It was all connected. But to what? Around midnight, Julia heard a noise from downstairs. It was soft at first, almost like the sound of wind rustling through the trees. But as it grew louder, she realized it was the sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving through the house. She got out of bed, careful not to wake Mark, and made her way to the hallway. As she descended the stairs, she could hear the footsteps getting closer, moving toward the basement door. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw it. The basement door was open again. Her heart raced as she approached the door. She knew she shouldn't go down there, that whatever was in the basement was dangerous. But something compelled her to open the door and descend into the darkness once more. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. The door to the hidden room was ajar, and as Julia approached it, she felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She spun around, but no one was there. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, and suddenly, one of them lunged at her. Julia screamed and stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadowy figure loomed over her, its form twisting and writhing as though it were made of smoke. She tried to run, but the figure blocked her path, its cold, dark presence filling the room. Just as the figure reached for her, there was a loud crash from upstairs. The shadow seemed to hesitate, then slowly began to retreat, melting back into the darkness. Julia took the opportunity to flee, racing up the stairs and slamming the basement door behind her. She found Mark and Lily waiting at the top of the stairs, their faces pale with fear. "There's something in this house," Julia gasped, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." Without another word, they gathered their things and fled the house, not stopping until they were miles away. For years, Kyle and Emily had saved up for their dream home. After months of searching, they found it. A beautiful 2-story house with a sprawling garden, a quiet neighborhood, and enough space to raise their 2 young children, Ava and Dylan. It was perfect. The previous owners had moved out abruptly, but the real estate agent assured them it was only because they had received a job offer overseas. The house was a bit older than they originally wanted, but its charm and location outweighed any concerns. From the moment they stepped through the front door, Emily felt an odd sense of familiarity. The hardwood floors creaked under their feet as they moved through the rooms, admiring the high ceilings and vintage fixtures. There was a slight chill in the air despite it being summer, but Emily brushed it off. She was too excited about finally moving into their forever home to let anything dampen her spirits. After a long day of unpacking and setting up the kids' rooms, the family gathered in the living room, exhausted but happy. "This is it," Kyle said, raising a glass of wine. "Here's to the start of something amazing." But that first night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It started with small things. The sound of footsteps on the stairs when everyone was asleep. The occasional cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. Emily convinced herself it was just her imagination, a side effect of moving into a new, unfamiliar house. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. It began with Ava. One morning, over breakfast, the 5-year-old looked up from her cereal with wide eyes and said, "Mommy, there's a lady in my room." Emily nearly dropped her cup of coffee. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Ava pointed toward the hallway leading to her bedroom. "She was standing by my bed last night. She didn't say anything, but I saw her." Kyle, who was sitting across the table, exchanged a worried glance with Emily. "Ava, honey," he said gently, "there's no lady in the house. You must have had a bad dream." Ava shook her head, her little face serious. "No, Daddy. She was real. She's always there." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, but she forced a smile. "It's just your imagination, sweetie. There's nothing to be scared of." But as the days went on, it wasn't just Ava. Dylan, who was only 3, began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming. He refused to sleep in his room, insisting that there were bad people in there. At first, Kyle and Emily thought it was just normal childhood fears, but when they started hearing things themselves, they realized something was very wrong. Late at night, after the kids were asleep, Emily would hear voices, faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. At first, she thought it was the wind or the house settling, but the voices grew louder and more distinct. They were always just on the edge of comprehension, as though someone were speaking in the next room, too far away to be understood but close enough to be unsettling. One night, while she was folding laundry in the bedroom, she heard a clear, unmistakable voice whisper her name. "Emily." She froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Slowly, she turned around, but there was no one there. A few weeks after moving in, Emily began noticing something strange about the basement. It was an unfinished space, mostly used for storage, but there was something about it that felt wrong. Whenever she passed by the door, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something was waiting just beyond the threshold. The door itself was heavy, made of dark wood, with an old brass handle that creaked when turned. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Emily decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and made her way down the creaky stairs, each step echoing ominously in the empty house. The basement was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the air smelled damp and musty. As she shone the flashlight around the room, her beam landed on something that made her heart stop. At the far end of the basement, there was another door, a small, narrow one she hadn't noticed before. It was partially hidden behind an old bookshelf, as though someone had tried to conceal it. The door was different from the rest of the house, its wood darker and more worn, like it had been there for much longer than the rest of the structure. Curiosity and fear battled within her, but before she could think better of it, she stepped forward and grabbed the handle. The door was locked, but when she twisted the knob, it gave way with a soft click. Behind the door was a small room, barely more than a closet, but what caught her attention was the strange symbol carved into the wall. It was an intricate design, one she didn't recognize, but it sent a chill down her spine. There was something malevolent about it, something ancient and dangerous. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and Emily felt a presence behind her. She spun around, but the basement was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent this time. Panicking, Emily slammed the door shut and ran back upstairs, her heart racing. She didn't sleep that night, and the next morning, she told Kyle about what she had found. He looked concerned but skeptical, suggesting it was probably just an old storage room that hadn't been used in years. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much darker lurking in their home. The next few nights were filled with restless sleep and unsettling dreams. Emily dreamed of the house, only it wasn't their house, not exactly. It was darker, colder, and the walls seemed to whisper with secrets she couldn't understand. In her dreams, she wandered through endless hallways, always hearing footsteps just behind her but never seeing anyone. And always, there was the symbol, glowing faintly on the walls, pulsing with an eerie light. During the day, things were no better. The strange occurrences escalated. Objects began moving on their own, books falling off shelves, doors opening and closing with no one near them. The children became increasingly anxious, refusing to play in certain rooms of the house. Ava stopped going into her bedroom altogether, insisting that the lady was watching her. One afternoon, as Emily was preparing lunch, she heard a soft knock at the front door. When she opened it, there was no one there, just an empty porch and the wind rustling the trees. She closed the door, a feeling of unease settling over her. Later that evening, while Kyle was working late, Emily heard the knock again. This time, when she opened the door, a figure stood at the threshold. It was an older woman, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow. She wore a long, dark coat, and her hands were clasped in front of her as though in prayer. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice low and rasping. Emily felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something about the woman wasn't right. "I'm sorry," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're not accepting visitors right now." The woman smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been here before," she whispered. "This house, it remembers me." Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. After the encounter with the strange woman, things in the house took a turn for the worse. The whispers became constant, filling the rooms with an oppressive presence. The once welcoming home now felt hostile, as though it were alive and angry. Emily began experiencing strange blackouts, moments where she would lose track of time, only to find herself in different parts of the house with no memory of how she got there. Kyle, too, started to notice the changes. He would come home from work to find Emily staring blankly out the window, her face pale and her eyes distant. When he asked her what was wrong, she would just shake her head and say, "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. One evening, while Kyle was putting the kids to bed, Emily found herself drawn to the basement once again. She didn't want to go, but it was as if something was pulling her, compelling her to return to the strange door at the back of the room. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw that the door was already open, the symbol on the wall glowing faintly in the darkness. As she stepped inside, the room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with a malevolent energy. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. And then she heard it, her name, spoken in a voice that wasn't her own. Emily. She tried to leave, but her body wouldn't move. It was as if invisible hands were holding her in place, forcing her to stay. The symbol on the wall pulsed with light, and suddenly, Emily felt a sharp pain in her chest, like something was trying to claw its way inside her. The room spun, and the last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of the door slamming shut behind her. When Kyle found Emily the next morning, she was lying at the bottom of the basement stairs, unconscious. He rushed her to the hospital where the doctor said she had suffered a severe concussion. But Kyle knew there was more to it than that. When Emily woke up, she was different. Her eyes, once full of warmth and love, were now cold and distant. She spoke in short, clipped sentences as though she were a stranger in her own body. The children were terrified of her, refusing to go near her, and Kyle began to fear that whatever was haunting the house had taken hold of his wife. Desperate for answers, Kyle reached out to a local priest, Father O'Malley, who had experience with paranormal activity. The priest agreed to come to the house, and as soon as he stepped through the door, he knew they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple haunting. "This house is cursed," Father O'Malley said, his voice grave. "There is a darkness here, an evil that has been awakened." He performed a blessing on the house, but it had little effect. The strange occurrences continued and Emily's condition worsened. She would have violent outbursts, screaming at the children and breaking things around the house. At night, she would wander the halls speaking in a language Kyle didn't recognize, her eyes blank and unseeing. Father O'Malley returned, this time with the tools for an exorcism. The ritual was long and grueling, the air in the house thick with tension. As the priest recited prayers and splashed holy water on the walls, Emily screamed, thrashing against the invisible force that held her captive. For hours, the battle raged on, the house shaking as though it were alive. But finally, with one last agonized scream, the presence left her, and Emily collapsed to the floor, unconscious but free. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The strange occurrences stopped, and the house felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Emily recovered from her ordeal, though she had no memory of what had happened during the time she was possessed. The children, too, seemed to forget the terror they had experienced, their laughter once again filling the halls. But Kyle couldn't forget. He couldn't forget the way Emily had changed, the darkness that had taken hold of her. And he couldn't forget the symbol in the basement, the symbol that still lingered in his mind even though Father O'Malley had destroyed it during the exorcism. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room enjoying a quiet night at home, Kyle heard something that made his blood run cold, a faint whisper coming from the walls. Emily. Despite the exorcism, the presence in the house never truly left. It remained lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. Kyle and Emily decided to sell the house and move far away. But before they could leave, the house claimed one final victim. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Ava disappeared. One moment she was playing in the backyard, and the next, she was gone. The police were called, a search was conducted, but there was no sign of her. Weeks passed, and still there was no trace of their daughter. Emily was inconsolable, and Kyle was consumed with guilt. He knew deep down that the house had taken her. that whatever evil still resided within those walls had claimed her as its own. Years later, after they had moved to a new town and tried to rebuild their lives, Kyle received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside was a single piece of paper with only one word written on it: Ava. And in the background, faint but unmistakable, was the symbol. The same symbol that had been carved into the wall of the basement all those years ago. The house had taken her, and it would never let go. When Jessica and Tom bought their new home, they believed they had found their dream house. Located on the outskirts of a small town, the Victorian-style house was charming, with its ornate woodwork, wrap-around porch, and expansive gardens. It was exactly what they had been looking for. The price was surprisingly low, which they attributed to its age and the need for some renovations. The previous owners had left in a hurry, and the house had been on the market for several months. As they settled in, they found themselves captivated by the house's old-world charm. The grand staircase, the intricate moldings, and the large windows that bathed the rooms in natural light made it feel like a piece of history. The house had a warm, welcoming atmosphere, despite its creaky floors and the occasional draft that swept through the rooms. One rainy afternoon, as they were unpacking the last of the boxes, Jessica stumbled upon an old dusty door in the back of a closet. It was hidden behind a wall of built-in shelves and looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Curiosity piqued. She called Tom over to investigate. "Look at this," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "I don't remember seeing this door before." Tom frowned, wiping dust from the handle. "It's probably just an old storage room," he said. "But let's see what's inside." They unlocked the door and found a narrow, dimly lit staircase leading down into darkness. The air was cold and musty, and a sense of foreboding hung over them as they descended into the basement. The basement was unlike the rest of the house, unfinished, with exposed pipes and bare concrete walls. It was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and dusty antiques that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. As they explored the basement, they discovered a small, cluttered room at the back, filled with old faded photographs and peculiar objects. Jessica found a collection of antique dolls, their glass eyes staring vacantly from their shelves. There were also old books with yellowed pages, and an ornate mirror covered in a thick layer of dust. As she examined the mirror, she felt a strange sensation, as though someone was watching her. She dismissed it as her imagination, but Tom noticed a cold chill in the air. As the days went by, Jessica began to experience unsettling occurrences. Objects in the house would move on their own, and she would hear faint whispers in the dark. Tom, who had always been skeptical of such things, brushed it off as stress from moving and adjusting to their new home. But when he began to experience the same disturbances, he started to worry. One night, while Tom was working late in his home office, Jessica was alone in the living room. She heard the faint sound of footsteps upstairs, followed by the creak of the floorboards. When she went to investigate, she found nothing out of place. The house was silent and still. The disturbances grew more frequent and intense. Jessica started seeing fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of her eye. The whispers grew louder, and the cold spots in the house became more pronounced. The once charming house now felt oppressive and haunted. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Jessica was sitting in the living room when she saw a figure appear in the hallway. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with a sorrowful expression on her face. Jessica's heart raced as the apparition slowly floated toward her. "Who are you?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. The ghostly figure didn't respond, but Jessica could feel a deep sense of sadness emanating from her. The apparition reached out with a ghostly hand, and Jessica felt a cold, clammy touch on her arm. Before she could react, the figure vanished, leaving Jessica shaken and frightened. Tom came home later that night and found Jessica sitting on the couch, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She told him what she had seen, but Tom was skeptical. He suggested that it was just a result of the storm and the stress of moving. He tried to comfort her, But Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Determined to find out more about their home, Jessica began researching its history. She visited the local library and pored over old records, newspaper clippings, and historical documents. She learned that the house had once belonged to a wealthy family in the early 1900s. The family had mysteriously disappeared one night, leaving the house abandoned for many years. According to local legend, the family had been involved in occult practices, and there were rumors of dark rituals and unspeakable deeds. The house had a dark reputation, and many people believed it was cursed. Jessica's research uncovered a disturbing fact. The woman she had seen was likely Eleanor Ashford, the daughter of the family who had disappeared. Eleanor was said to have been a troubled soul, deeply involved in her family's dark practices. Her fate was unknown, but some believed she had been sacrificed in one of the rituals. Jessica's discovery only deepened her fear. She shared her findings with Tom, who was now more open to the possibility that something supernatural was at play. Together, they decided to seek help from a paranormal investigator, hoping to find answers and, hopefully, a way to rid their home of the malevolent presence. The paranormal investigator, a woman named Lydia, arrived with a variety of equipment: electromagnetic field meters, infrared cameras, and audio recorders. Lydia set up her equipment throughout the house, paying particular attention to the basement and the hidden room Jessica had discovered. As Lydia conducted her investigation, she recorded strange readings on her equipment, unexplained spikes in electromagnetic fields, and unusual temperature drops. The audio recorders picked up faint, disembodied voices and eerie whispers. During the investigation, Lydia led a seance to attempt to communicate with the spirit. The room grew cold, and the temperature dropped significantly. The whispers grew louder, and the flickering candles cast unsettling shadows on the walls. Lydia's attempt to communicate with Eleanor Ashford was met with resistance. The spirit was angry and agitated, refusing to answer questions directly. Lydia's equipment went haywire, and she experienced a powerful sense of dread. At the climax of the seance, Lydia was thrown across the room by an unseen force. The atmosphere became heavy and oppressive, and Lydia declared that the spirit was extremely powerful and vengeful. She suggested performing a cleansing ritual to drive the spirit away, but warned that it might not be enough to fully rid the house of its dark presence. Determined to rid their home of the malevolent spirit, Jessica and Tom prepared for the cleansing ritual. They gathered supplies, a mixture of herbs, holy water, and sacred symbols, as instructed by Lydia. The ritual was to be performed at midnight, when the veil between the worlds was thinnest. As they prepared for the ritual, the house seemed to grow darker, the whispers more insistent. The temperature in the basement dropped to near freezing levels, and the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on them. The ritual began with Jessica and Tom reciting prayers and invoking protective spirits. They sprinkled holy water around the house and burned the herbs, filling the air with the pungent smell of sage and cedar. Lydia led the ritual, her voice steady as she chanted ancient incantations. During the ritual, the house seemed to come alive with anger. Doors slammed shut, and the walls trembled. The temperature fluctuated wildly, and the whispers grew into a cacophony of rage. Jessica and Tom held fast, their resolve unshaken as they completed the ritual. As the final words were spoken and the last of the herbs were burned, a sudden silence fell over the house. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. Jessica and Tom felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but they knew it was too soon to tell if the ritual had truly succeeded. In the weeks following the ritual, Jessica and Tom noticed a marked change in the house. The unsettling whispers and cold spots disappeared, and the atmosphere became lighter and more welcoming. The house, once filled with dread, now felt like a home again. Jessica and Tom resumed their lives, grateful to be free from the haunting presence that had plagued them. They continued to make improvements to the house, restoring it to its former glory. The old photographs and antiques were carefully cataloged and stored, and the hidden room was sealed off to prevent any further disturbances. Despite the return to normalcy, Jessica and Tom remained wary. They knew that the spirit of Eleanor Ashford was not easily vanquished, and they couldn't be sure if it had truly been banished. They occasionally heard faint whispers and experienced brief moments of unease, but they chose to believe that the worst was behind them. As they settled into their new life, they found solace in the knowledge that they had faced their fears and emerged victorious. The house, with all its history and secrets, had become their home, a place where they could create new memories and live their lives free from the shadows of the past. One night, years after the cleansing ritual, Jessica and Tom were sorting through old belongings in the attic. They came across a hidden compartment behind a false wall, filled with dusty old letters and journals. Among them was a journal belonging to Eleanor Ashford. Jessica and Tom read through the journal, discovering the dark secrets of Eleanor's life. The entries revealed her involvement in her family's occult practices, and her growing sense of dread as she realized the true nature of the rituals. The final entries described her fear of being sacrificed and her desperate plea for help. As they reached the last page, they found a note written in a shaky hand. "I am sorry. Forgive me. The house will never let go." The revelation left Jessica and Tom with a deep sense of unease. They had thought they had rid the house of its dark presence, but the journal's final words suggested that the house itself was the source of the malevolence. They couldn't escape the feeling that the house had claimed something of them, that it had left an indelible mark on their lives. With heavy hearts, they closed the journal and put it away, leaving the past behind them. The house, though now a place of peace, remained a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced. They chose to move forward, cherishing the memories they had made and hoping that the house would find peace, just as they had. The forgotten room remained sealed, a silent testament to the horrors that once lurked within. And though Jessica and Tom continued their lives, they knew that the echoes of the past would always linger, a reminder of the darkness they had overcome.